You're listening to Deconstructive Criticism. I'm Aaron Flam. Benedict Beckeld has written the book on Western self-contempt. We will be talking about what that means for the current state of the world. But first, a huge thanks for supporting Deconstructive Criticism on patreon.com/Aaron Flam or Swish 0768 943737 0768 943737. You can also buy my own book, This is a Swedish Tiger, in English at my website, although it might be more practical since the shipping costs are huge to buy it as an ebook on Amazon Kindle. This is a Swedish Tiger can be found on Amazon. Please purchase your copy today. Benedict Beckeld was born in Uppsala, Sweden, and grew up in both Uppsala and Stockholm before moving to New York in his early teens. His academic journey is remarkable, spanning continents and prestigious institutions. He has a PhD in philosophy, Greek and Latin from Heidelberg University, and has lived, studied and taught in France, Italy and Germany. Benedict speaks several languages that we use today, as well as ancient Greek and Latin. He has a deep understanding of history, art, philosophy. In short, they don't make them like this anymore. Benedict is a prolific writer whose work spans philosophy, memoir, and poetry. His intellectual pursuits focus on aesthetics, contemporary culture, political philosophy, the philosophy of history, and ancient Greece, fields in which he continues to make significant contributions. In this episode, we will be talking about his book on the history of oikophobia in the West, with the very apt title, Western Self-Contempt. Although I don't agree with Benedict on free will, I found the book very entertaining and interesting, and I think as a study of oikophobia in the West, it is indispensable, not only because this might be the only real book on the subject, but also because he shows in a very convincing way that the fall of civilizations is baked into their rise, and that history seems to behave in helical, cyclical fashion because of human nature. If all that sounds a bit complicated, we are fortunate enough to have the author here explain what he means. Enjoy. So, welcome to Deconstructive Criticism, Benedict Beckeld.
Thank you very much for having me.
Full disclosure, we didn't hang out as children, but your mother was my bar mitzvah teacher.
Yes, that's my understanding, yeah.
Because you were born and raised for the first 12 years of your life here in Sweden.
For the first 14 years, actually, yeah.
All right.
Born in Uppsala, but then we lived in Stockholm for 3 years before we emigrated, yeah.
Yeah, my kid brother David remembers you.
Oh, does he?
Yes.
Okay. Was he and I in the same year, I wonder? Or?
Well, he was born early in 81, like in January. And you were
I was born January 80, yeah, exactly.
Okay,
so 1 year older. So I guess maybe we were at Hilleskolan or Strömska, maybe at the same time, possibly.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
And since then, you have been doing what exactly?
Since then, I've been, so we went to the United States, to New York City, which has been sort of my base ever since. But much of my university studies I completed in Germany, actually at the University of Heidelberg. And I was an academic researcher and a professor also in France for a while, in Italy, mostly in France. France and Germany, sort of spent about 10 years there academically. Professor of philosophy and classical philology. And but now being back in the United States for about the last 10 years, basically just focusing on my writing, books, articles, everything like that. Can't really teach in the United States because even though overall the United States is more right-wing than Europe, specifically the academic world is so radically left-wing in the United States, I think even more so than here, that for people like me, there are no jobs.
But what do you mean when you say people like you? Because you taught philosophy in Italy and France and Germany. That would make it continental philosophy,
yeah,
I suppose?
I didn't teach in Italy. I was just researching, but in Germany I just taught Latin and Greek, but philosophy I also taught in France, yeah.
But is it like continental philosophy that you adhere to?
Not especially. I mean, I don't really distinguish between them, but I guess, yes, I do work more. If I'm going to talk about my own philosophy, people would probably call it more continental than analytic. But to me, that distinction is rather unimportant. I write whatever is interesting. But in terms of what I taught, yes, I did teach more continental than analytic, yeah.
You write out of what is interesting I think that would summarize the book quite well. Actually, because I read your book. I think the title is very apt, Western Self-Contempt, where you map out the history of Western oikophobia,
Yes,
which you deem much better than African or Semitic oikophobia.
Right.
No.
Well, it's whenever Africans, I mentioned that it's just about one page in there because sometimes people ask, is there such a thing as non-Western oikophobia? And there is, but it tends to happen because of Western influence. So their oikophobia is a bit of an imitation of ours, so to speak, as happens in many other areas as well.
I think we'll get back to that, but. So you go through the term oikophobia, which is a rather new terminology to describe self-contempt, really, or specifically contempt for one's nation and home.
For one's nation, one's own culture, one's own people, yes, and one's own history, basically everything that can be associated with one's own culture, yeah.
I was just asking you about where you stand epistemologically, because I read the entire book, and you talk a lot about epistemology, more than a comedian would want, really.
But you also studied philosophy, didn't you? I think.
No,
right?
well, I've read philosophy, on the side.
Okay.
But not in an academic setting.
Okay.
So it was still kind of hard to place you, and that's why I asked.
That's actually, I've gotten some critique from the right. I mean, most of the critique I've gotten, as you probably would expect, has been from the left, but some critique from the right because they feel that I don't take a strong enough stand against it, and that I don't sort of militate against the left and against the oikophobes in the book. And my reply to that is always that that's not really my job as a philosopher. I mean, anyone who reads the book can tell that I'm not a left-winger for sure. But my job, there are already enough books, shall we say, by political scientists and various pundits, political commentators, who rail against left-wing self-hate. But what I'm trying to do in this book is to give the first proper philosophical, systematic treatment of cultural self-hate. And this is really the first book, if I may flatter myself, this is really the first book that does so. You have certain screeds against left-wing self-hate and so on, but what I try to do in this book is really to lay it all out and to understand it, why it happens, how it works, and so on. And so in a book like that, there isn't a whole lot of room for me to come in and sort of just start a tirade against left-wing oikophobia. So I'm fairly, in that sense, I'm more descriptive in the book. But of course, personally, I am certainly against oikophobia. No question about that. But
you go through, and it is decidedly a Western phenomenon. You go through Greece, Rome, France, Britain, and the US.
Yes.
Would you like to tell us a bit about Greek oikophobia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it all starts in Greece, which makes sense because that's where the West starts, really. Obviously, our mutual Jewish culture is also part of the West, but that really enters later through the late Roman Empire, through Christianity. So Greece gives us the first example of oikophobia, and it really comes about, and we see this pattern then repeating itself. Mutatis mutandis, obviously, the details change, but we see the same pattern writ large repeat itself in future civilizations, including our own. And I think that's why it's so important to start with Greece, because that really helps us understand why we hate ourselves. So many segments of our own culture is self-hating. Everybody recognizes the phenomenon, but most people don't, and you see this all the time, people asking themselves, why is this even happening? Why do people act this way? And so to understand that, we start with Greece and then move forward. And in Greece, it basically happens, it starts to happen. There's certain signs of it arising before it actually happens. But it starts in the late 5th century BC in Athens. And it's not a coincidence that it starts in Athens as opposed to other Greek cities, because Athens is the city where we have the most freedom, intellectual freedom, the most democracy, not by our standards, obviously, but by their standards, the most democracy, the most freedom for intellectuals to start self-questioning and to criticize their own culture without fear of the powers that be, without fear from the government. And Athens is, especially after the Persian Wars, Athens becomes the wealthiest city, certainly one of the wealthiest cities in Greece, certainly the most powerful, the Athenian Empire. And when you have this sense of security, this sense that there is no existential threat, and which there isn't really, because they've defeated the Persians, so they're not afraid for their lives anymore. That was the generation of their grandfathers who fought in the Persian Wars in the early 5th century. Once that happens, you have a free intellectual space, a certain sense of egalitarianism, again by Greek standards, obviously not by our standards, a certain sense of egalitarianism, a certain sense of being able to write what you want without having anything to fear, certain degree of wealth. These are the circumstances for oikophobia. And this is also why it tends to be...
You express it in your book as the creation of a large leisure class.
Yes.
People who not only have the freedoms, but also the time to engage in them.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And this is, you have leisure classes also in other civilizations, but they tend, first of all, to be much smaller. And they also tend to be more closely tied to the government or to the powers that be, a small clique around the emperor or around the king, whatever the case is. In Greece, in Athens specifically, you have a leisure class that is large enough without being tied to, for example, Pericles, the Archon of Athens, or without being tied specifically to the government. They're just sort of, it's a layer of aristocrats who sort of just do what they want, but they're still operating in a free intellectual space. And that's very important. That's why it's also Western, because we've had much more of that than non-Western civilizations. And so when they no longer feel the threat of the Persians, they start to look at their own culture. When the Persians are just about to invade and to destroy your city, you don't have time to look at your own culture's shortcomings. You're focused on the external threat. But all of us need, some more than others, but every people needs an enemy. It needs something against which to define itself. And when that enemy has disappeared, it's no longer on the horizon, it's been defeated, then you need to define yourself vis-a-vis something else. You always need an other. And that other then becomes your own civilization, your own culture, more precisely other people within your own culture.
More commonly.
Yes, exactly. More commonly other people within your own culture, because nobody remembers the Persians anymore. That was what our grandfathers had to deal with. Now you have to deal with Joe down the street. Or whoever, Socrates down the street. And so that's what becomes the cause of the next generation's self-definition. And so that's when you start, your only way then of rising, and we all want to aggrandize ourselves to some degree or other, your only way of rising then is to define yourself against other Greeks or against other Athenians. And that's when the self-questioning phase starts coming in. One starts to question one's own religion. That's usually the first sign before actual oikophobia. So you have somebody like Euripides in his plays who questions Greek religion. He's not an oikophobe. He was still quite a patriotic Athenian. But that's sort of the first step. And then later on, especially, and now we're getting into the early 4th century BC, sort of the students of Socrates. I mentioned a bunch of the names that are relevant. They're the ones who then really become full-blown oikophobes.
They're relevant, I think.
Antisthenes, yeah, he was definitely, he's a significant one.
And I think personally you misread Diogenes.
Oh, yes? Okay.
Yes. You take him as an example of a full-fledged oikophobe.
Yeah.
In Athens.
Yes.
But he was from Sinope.
Yeah, I do mention that in the book, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you don't delve into it really, because you say there are people who would differentiate, and you talk about a general Greek mentality, which I imagine you think stretched to Sinope and should encompass Diogenes.
It's more Athenian, and I do focus more on Athens. But he comes to Athens fairly early. I mean, he's most of his career as a philosopher. So you're right, he's not from there, but most of his career as a philosopher is in Athens, because Athens in those days was, even though they had lost in the Peloponnesian War and they were certainly a declining power, nonetheless, Athens had such a reputation by then. So it was sort of like later on Rome, or later on London, or later on New York City. It was the place, or Alexandria for that matter in the Hellenistic era. It was the place where you went to if you wanted to be active, if you wanted to be somebody. Yeah. And so he went there, and he was
also good parties.
Good parties, and women. For sure. Yeah, yes. No doubt. Yes, I'm sure. That's they don't really teach us much about that at university, but yes, yes, you're probably right. But so you're right. He's not from there, but he still defines himself very much against that tradition, and he spends most of his life there. So I still think it's fair to say that he's an oikophobe in that part. It would be, I mean, I could take myself as an example.
No, I think he's an oikophobe. Right. I agree on that part.
Yeah.
What I think is, Because as my impression was when I read about him in your book was that he is sort of the personification of his time, the zeitgeist.
Right.
And as a comedian, I think you read him incorrectly, because I think that he appears when they are the most xenophobic, according to your definition, at the same time as they don't really have anything to back it up with anymore. Do you understand?
Yes, although I don't think that's when they are the most xenophobic, the Athenians in the early 4th century.
I wouldn't know. You're the expert in Greece and Rome.
Yeah, but I think their xenophobia is earlier. The Athenians specifically, I would say, are probably the most xenophobic in the mid-5th century. So that's when they've already defeated the Persians. So they have something to pride themselves in. And they can, with some justice, say that they were the saviors of Greece. They weren't the only ones, but they did bear the brunt of it. And they were pressuring, at that point, they were pressuring other Greek cities into joining the empire and into paying, if that wasn't the official, their official stance, but it essentially boiled down to protection money, basically, to themselves. I would say that was when they were the most xenophobic. Into the Peloponnesian War, they were very, to put it bluntly, they were very full of themselves. So, for example, there was a phase early on in the Peloponnesian War where they had the Spartans cornered, and they had an opportunity to make peace with Sparta with honor, and a peace advantageous to themselves. And they turned down the opportunity and decided to continue to fight because they really wanted to humiliate Sparta, and they should have known to stop while they were ahead, but they didn't, and so ultimately they lost. But I would say that's when they were the most xenophobic and the most vainly proud. And that was pretty much still one generation before Diogenes.
Because I would imagine, as a comedian, would be that he is a contrarian against something that he sees as dominant but incorrect.
Yeah. So look, and this is an important point you raise, and this is also why, to go back to your earlier question, that I'm not really positioning myself so strongly against it, that I'm taking a more descriptive role, because I don't want the reader to think that simply because someone is an oikophobe or because I call someone an oikophobe, that I'm therefore criticizing everything they do. I mentioned Euripides earlier. He wasn't an oikophobe, but I mentioned that he starts to plant certain seeds that will then lead to oikophobia. And I absolutely love Euripides. He's one of my favorite poets ever. And so simply because someone is an oikophobe or does something oikophobic, I wouldn't thereby say that therefore we have to criticize everything that this person does.
And the seed he plants, Euripides, is a critique of religion.
Exactly,
basically.
Yeah.
Which you posit as one of the most important cohesive factors of early civilization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Antisthenes is another example. There are certain parts of his philosophy with which I wholeheartedly agree. But there are certain other aspects that I think can be fairly described as oikophobic. In Diogenes' case, Diogenes is, I would say, a little more, maybe a little more obnoxious. He does certain things that are sort of just so typically oikophobic, because one of the big things about oikophobia is vanity. A person becomes an oikophobe because he or she is vain and feels that he wants to raise himself above other people in his immediate surroundings. So vanity is a big engine of oikophobia. And Diogenes acts in a way that really shows he is very vain. But that doesn't mean that some of the critique can't be justified. Absolutely. And I talk about Plato, for example. Plato is not an oikophobe. Plato is what I call an expression of reactionary oikophobia. That is to say, a conservative who is reacting against the decline of his own civilization. And that's critique that I can certainly agree with. Chapter 10 in the book is a pretty sharp critique against the United States, my own country or my adopted country. So critique can certainly be justified, but there is a certain point at which that critique ceases to be very specific. Like if you're criticizing a specific aspect of your own culture, or you criticize a specific action of your own government, that's obviously not phobic. But it comes to the point that you sort of have almost a level of disgust at any aspect, at anything that reminds you of your own culture, and you act out that disgust at every possible opportunity, and sort of you become allergic to everything that is typically Athenian or typically American or typically Swedish, whatever it may be. And that's when you're talking about oikophobia. And that doesn't mean that such a person can't have valid contributions to offer in some other area, certainly. So if I say Diogenes is an oikophobe, I wouldn't say that he's all bad, but
no. Personally, I think I connected with him as a very young person through the anecdotes, because there's no writings. It was the one where he walks down the street of Athens with a lamp looking for a human, but all he can find is rascals and whatever old bad word for people could be.
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons why I do think he's an oikophobic, because of that anecdote, and it's because it's a little bit.
But is that well? There might be a measure of vanity in him being the only human looking for his kin,
right?
Sure, absolutely. But is it not also
he's looking for a virtuous,
aimed at the vanity of the Athenians? For believing themselves to be human?
So absolutely. I would say if that were the only thing he had done in this regard, I'd say you're right. But the thing is, we also, and yeah, I mean, it's anecdotal from other writers, because as you say, we don't have anything directly. But supposedly, by the best accounts that we have, and this is what we have to go by, obviously, he really acted out. It's not only that he did that, he also acted out foreign customs, as opposed to whenever he had an opportunity, when there was an Athenian way of doing something and a foreign way of doing something, he always did it the foreign way. And if you take that coupled with the anecdotes, for example, that he was walking around with a light looking for a virtuous person, an honest person, yes, then I think that other anecdote that you mentioned is an additional expression of oikophobia. Obviously, that doesn't mean that there wasn't a certain conceit and a certain false pride that was worthy of criticism in Athens. I think you're absolutely right.
Well,
Yeah, no, there's plenty to criticize, but I think coupled with the other things we know about Diogenes, I think that fits the pattern, even if one can say, in certain sense, okay, some of that critique was justified.
And then we move on to Rome.
Yes.
How does their sort of oikophobia express itself then?
Yeah, so oikophobia among the civilizations that I discuss in greater detail in the book, which you mentioned, Greece, Rome, France, Britain, and the United States, Rome is the one that has the least of it. And that's because, well, there's several reasons. I mean, partly they're managing such a vast empire that sort of by necessity they have to be very martial, they have to be very aggressive, which is, as one can imagine, rather antithetical to oikophobia. But even from the very beginning, if we compare Rome with Athens, specifically, Athens always prided itself on its, I shouldn't say always, but certainly in the relevant period, 5th century and 4th century, prided itself on its intellectualism, on its artistic prowess, and so on. And as is always the case, artists and intellectuals, they tend to be the ones who are more prone to this vice. Whereas Rome always prided itself on its manliness, on its martial prowess. And it had a much stronger sense of hierarchy and patriarchality, and in its culture well before the empire. I mean, in the Republic certainly as well. And so in those circumstances, as one can imagine, it's more difficult for oikophobia to develop. And so if one is to compare it, there is relatively less of it in Rome. However, the exact same pattern, it doesn't grow as intense, but the exact same pattern is visible in Rome as well. That is to say, it starts with questioning of the religion. By the time you're in the early empire already, people don't believe in the gods anymore. And they sort of think that Roman traditions are something old-fashioned and quaint, and they start to flirt more with Eastern religions and with Eastern fashion and things like that. And they start to criticize, Tacitus is a good example, Seneca, you have a bunch of them. They start to criticize their own martial nature, their own imperialistic nature. And again, one can certainly say, and I mentioned that in the introduction, one can certainly criticize Roman imperialism. From our point of view, we would probably tend to agree with those Romans who said that, maybe we're being a little too imperialistic and we're being too brutal toward other peoples. But that's not really the point. Right? The point is that we see the same pattern develop. Oikophobia does develop, where you start to express disgust. Petronius is another good example. You start to experience this sort of disgust at your own traditions. And I think the word disgust is important. It doesn't have to express itself through disgust, oikophobia, but it is something that is very common both in antiquity and modernity. Like you see a manifestation of your own culture, and you just sort of have this expression of, I don't want to deal with that. And that is very typical, and you see that in Rome as well. So
because I think when you get to finish the chapter you've written about Rome, by then you have established a rather interesting pattern or discovered a pattern.
regarding how you look at it, of first strong religiosity, a nation, as you would describe it, not really aware of itself, but then through war and an external threat that it overcomes, it becomes self-aware and also thinks itself superior to other cultures. And the more superior they become, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That they believe themselves to be superior, so they adorn the trappings of superiority. The external threat diminishes, and then oikophobia sets in through the large leisure class that's developed and how they start in-group fighting. And fragmentation into smaller and smaller entities, all fighting each other for power within the state or status. And we mentioned religiosity, it declines, but also androgyny increases. So will you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, so oikophobia is the sort of central, I think is the most useful concept because it's about being against one's own history and one's own traditions. But yes, so you have a bunch of ancillary phenomena that start to pop up around oikophobia because older traditions for all civilizations tend to be more patriarchal, more hierarchical, and so on. It might sound a little hackneyed, but that is how it is. And once that is rejected, that then leaves room for other things to crop up. So you have androgyny, as you mentioned. You have vegetarianism. Actually, is another one that's not a very popular one for me to mention. A lot of people get upset at that, but it doesn't mean that obviously that if you're a vegetarian you're an oikophobe. But it does mean that vegetarianism starts to become popular at the same time as you're rejecting older traditions.
Yes, but you said that in the book, at least, you write that has something to do with vanity and superiority as well.
Exactly, because you're measuring yourself against other people. Part of oikophobia, this is stronger in modernity because we have Christian values today that value the weak, which they did not have in ancient Greece and Rome. But there is still a certain sense of victimhood. Again, it's weaker in antiquity, so I'm not going to say that it's exactly always the same. It's not. But there is that certain sense as well. I mean, Tacitus talks about how the German tribes and the Britannic tribes are victims of imperial aggression, of Roman imperial aggression, something that would have been a silly thought 200-300 years earlier. And not just because they hadn't yet conquered that far, but simply because it's obvious that we're superior to everyone else. But when you have then defeated these other enemies, you have no other. You cannot consider yourself superior to the Germans anymore because they're no longer relevant. So you have to find a way to consider yourself superior to your neighbor, to Quintus down the street. And vegetarianism is one way of doing that. You say, you savage barbarians, you eat other animals. You see, I'm more enlightened, so I'm not going to hurt the animals. And so vegetarianism is another one. Pop spirituality, Eastern cults, again, Eastern religions, including Judaism, by the way, because from the point of view of Rome, of course, Judaism is just an Eastern cult of some kind. And so that becomes popular as well, just like Buddhism is popular amongst many oikophobes today. Again, doesn't mean that you're an oikophobe simply because you're a Buddhist, but there is a connection to a lot of people. Androgyny, of course, is very relevant for us now. The fact that we have this whole debate now about what is a woman and whether a trans woman is a woman and so on, that is an expression of a civilizational decline. There's absolutely no doubt, because that is an expression of androgyny. Again, every expression of androgyny is not exactly the same from civilization to civilization, but the fact that there is a movement toward androgyny in some way is absolutely clear as oikophobia sets in every civilization, including our own. Now, many of these things, and I also explain the reason for that in the book, become more and more extreme with every iteration. Now, Rome, again, is the exception to that.
It's funny, it's always Eastern cults that come in, and not, for instance, in Rome's case, Celtic or Gallic cults.
Yeah.
No one seems to be interested in the Gallic tradition.
Right, yes. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's a good point. Or, the, Scythian child sacrifice or anything like that, or human sacrifice. No, that's true. I think part of the reason for that is... it's not something I talk about in the book, but it's a good point. I think the reason for that is that in many ways, and to some extent I think that's still true today, the East is considered very advanced. And I mean, for us now, of course, Gallic or French would be part of the West, but the East, and this is true for the Greeks as well. I mean, Persia was a great civilization before Greece, before Athens, and certainly the same thing with Rome. We have a bit of a sense today that the guru in the Himalayas or whatever is of course very wise and not concerned with material things and so on, and that's can be something that can be very seductive. A little something of that in that sense is true as well. I mean, when Roman women go to Jewish soothsayers instead of their own traditional temples in Rome, there is a little bit of that sense, these wise women from the East that they don't really know anything about. They don't understand it very well, just like most oikophobes today don't understand the East very well. But there is that allure that other civilizations don't have. But I think probably their earlier development has something to do with it.
But lack of understanding of the other is part of oikophobia, right?
Absolutely.
You can't be an oikophobe if you understand other cultures fully.
So that's interesting.
Ignorance, maybe if your own culture is reprehensible.
Right. I mean, ignorance certainly helps, yes. There are, of course, oikophobes. In fact, academics tend to be more oikophobic. As I mentioned before, that's one of the reasons I can't teach in the United States, because I am not sufficiently oikophobic. And they tend to be relatively educated, of course, as at least relative to the rest of the population. And I talk, by the way, I give a 10-point list in the book about why intellectuals are the ones who tend to be most prone to treason. But part of that is that intellectuals aren't as educated as they used to be. They're not as intellectual as they used to be, first of all. But part of it is also that I don't really think knowledge really matters so much anymore. Once you've become vain enough that you become an oikophobe and you have to show your superiority at any price to your fellow citizen, I think knowledge of one's own civilization and knowledge of the fault of other civilizations becomes less relevant, because one is always more, and that in itself is normal, but one is always more open or knowledgeable about the faults of one's own home than about other homes. So even if one knows in the abstract that, yes, there has been genocide, other civilizations have also committed genocide, other civilizations also have forms of racism or whatever it may be. Had slaves, exactly. It's just not as present in people's minds. There are, of course, certain oikophobes who genuinely believe, who are very uneducated, who genuinely believe only America had slaves, or only we are the only ones who are racist. Obviously, they're extremely ignorant. But I think even for more educated people, that tends to be the case as well. And so when people ask me, what's the cure of oikophobia, and the sort of the answer that's often expected is, more education. I don't really think that's true, unfortunately, because in some individual cases, yes, but the kind of education, at least that our public schools can offer, is just not enough for people to really work against oikophobia, because it tends not to help. If anything, knowing that you're more educated than your fellow man, than your fellow citizen, if anything, just tends to raise your idea of self-worth, and with that, oikophobia as well. So
there are a few more points, I think, with the fall of Rome that corresponds to our own predicament in the West today. Let's see if we can go through them. We did androgyny. Men can be men, or men can be women, and vice versa.
Yeah.
The Roman ideal of the muscular, warlike man sort of dissipates and becomes a slender, non-muscular youth without a beard who is very androgynous. And we have a receding religion, or a replacement by Eastern cults. And then there were the government subsidies, right?
Yeah, so that's more, yes. So that's both, and in Greece as well. But that starts already in the Republic. One example I mentioned is the grain dole of Claudius, which is still in the late Republic, but certainly continues into the Empire. Dependence on the government most certainly goes hand in hand with oikophobia. I mean, again, it's a correlation. It's not a necessary connection, but historically, if you simply look at how it happens, that tends to be the case.
And why?
Right. So because basically it can be boiled down to the entitlement mentality. The entitlement mentality is something that arises when a civilization has sufficient wealth. When the Persians are about to invade, or whatever civilization we're talking about, when you're dealing with an existential threat, you don't feel entitled to anything. You're happy just to survive. When you have wealth, and when you see the people around you having wealth, the entitlement mentality starts to arise, again, quite naturally. And this is why also I call the oikophobia a natural phenomenon in the book, by which I don't mean that it's good, obviously not, by which I mean simply think it's something that naturally happens because of all the circumstances that come together. We should still fight it, but it does happen naturally in that sense. And the entitlement mentality and oikophobia go hand in hand, because you consider yourself superior as an oikophobe. You consider yourself individually superior by dint of the fact that the rest of your civilization is inferior, supposedly. And that is a sort of entitlement mentality. I have the right to this because I'm better than you. The government should give me this. So again, you don't have to be a socialist just because you're an oikophobe or vice versa. There is one form of socialism, especially early on, early socialism, that's actually quite nationalistic. And I mean, one looks obviously...
National socialism.
Right. Right, exactly, yes. Yeah, I was thinking more of the Soviet Union, but yeah, certainly. And I'm glad you make that point, actually, because that's a whole other discussion, but the fact that, National Socialism being always called far right, which is questionable. But in any case, they tend to go hand in hand for that reason. Oikophobes tend to be socialists and vice versa. Yeah, there are exceptions. But even socialists who are very nationalistic, they tend to be nationalistic in a very modern sense. They still tend to reject their older traditions. Actually, Japan is a good example of this. When they went through their reforms in the 1860s and so thereabouts, they started to reject the samurai class and everything like that. They were extremely nationalistic, but they were nationalistic in the sense that they wanted to westernize and they wanted to be more powerful than the West on Western terms. And so they were nationalistic and yet sort of anti-Japanese, oikophobic in a certain sense at the same time, because they rejected their old traditions, say we can never defeat the West if we all run around with swords.
But at the same time, no, because as I remember, the emperor at the time, whose name eludes me, I think he said, we will do all the things that the rest of the world does, but we will do it much better than them.
Right, yeah.
Because, it didn't need to be, he didn't need to follow up because we're Japanese, because that was the subtext.
Right,
yes.
Yeah, no, you're right. So it's certainly, it's neither completely one or completely the other. But even nationalism isn't always completely anti or un-oikophobic. But yeah, and again, it's a good reminder also not to say that everything is exactly the same. One mustn't make the mistake that I think people like Spengler make, or Toynbee, who basically, especially Spengler, my big problem with him, my book has been compared a little bit, a couple of times I've heard it compared to Spengler. Yeah, but my point, I mentioned Spengler only in a footnote, actually, but I say why I think it's quite different from Spengler, which is that he has this one model. Yes. And then he tries to he crams everything into it. And there are, if one reads Spengler carefully, one sees he makes a lot of mistakes. There's simply a lot of inaccuracies in it.
He bases every civilization on its mode of mathematics, basically. Yeah. And it's reducing everything into one variable.
Exactly. Yes. And he can't do that without just having a lot of inaccuracies and making a lot of mistakes in the book. In mine, I try to say, well, so first of all, I'm not talking about every aspect of the civilization. I'm talking specifically about oikophobia and ancillary phenomena, but of course, still with differences from civilization to civilization. But
that was why I was careful to call it an essay or a study, I think, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes.
I think that's reasonable.
What do you call it?
I simply called it a book, or I call it a monograph on oikophobia, but yeah.
All right. Monograph is nice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's. I don't always use the word because it always sounds a little academic. Sometimes it turns some people off. But it's. I call it. Yeah, probably study more. Probably
I think with the title, you've turned a lot of people off at the onset. So
yeah, that's probably true. Yeah, no doubt.
Another similarity with Rome is immigration, right?
Yes, absolutely. So that is less the case in Greece. The Greeks, even as they become oikophobic, they tend to have a very protective view of their own citizenship. If you're an Athenian, then that's very special, and not anybody can become an Athenian. But with Rome, yes, because they are, of course, a territorial power, unlike Athens, which was more, they had islands and so on under their control, but they weren't Athenian. They were still their own cities. Rome, by being a territorial power, necessarily has to incorporate a lot of peoples into their orbit. It's not necessarily immigration in the sense that people are coming from outside the empire into the empire, but of course the empire grows, and so it starts to include more and more people. It's internal immigration in the sense that then once they have incorporated other civilizations into their empire, a lot of the people in those peripheral civilizations move to Rome, of course, and so in that sense they have a great influence on the culture. I mean, if you walk down the street in Rome in 100 AD, you see all different kinds of people from all over the known world walking down the street in those days. And especially 3rd, 4th century AD, that also has an effect on the government in the sense that already, I mean, that development starts earlier. It already starts under Julius Caesar, actually, so quite early. But certainly by the 3rd century AD, you have so many Greek-speaking senators, 4th century certainly, from the eastern part of the empire, that basically you cannot say that the Roman government is genuinely Roman. Officially, they're Roman citizens, because Roman citizenship is extended later on under Caracalla, for example, and other emperors as well. But that certainly is the case today as well. I mean, you can think of certain governmental officials in various Western countries today whose culture is who have their cultural origins in another country, which could be okay. Like, it's not a problem in and of itself, but it does often lead to, not in every case, but it does often lead to a disloyalty toward the traditional values of that particular culture. I mean, I forget his name now, but I think of that Scottish parliamentarian a few months ago who became famous on social media because he complained about the fact that almost everyone in the Scottish government is white.
Yes.
Right.
I remember him. I don't know his name.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. But you know whom I mean. And so again, this is another example. And I think it's good to tie it to modern examples so that people really understand that when we're trying to make sense of what's going on now, when we're trying to understand it, we can see that, yes, these things have happened before, and that allows us really to understand why all of this is happening. When half the Senate in Rome consists of Greek-speaking people who speak Latin as a second language from the Middle East, then yeah, of course that is going to have an effect on the way policy is done. Of course, that's going to have an effect on the culture. It would be absurd if it didn't.
It's an erosion of the institutions.
Yes,
because they don't feel that they are represented anymore. I mean, when you were Roman and all the senators were Roman, then you felt a certain connection. But when they're Greek or, God forbid, from Gaul or Germania,
right?
Or how would you pronounce it?
Well, authentically Germania, yes.
Okay, yes. Then obviously, you start to lose faith in your institutions.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And that is what happens. And the various senators start to become more concerned with they start to feel that they represent more the people where they come from rather than Rome as a whole. It would, again, and that's why we call it natural, which is not that it's a good thing. It's simply that it would almost be strange if it didn't happen that way, considering the circumstances.
So the US is still ways away from Rome.
Yes.
But so far we have androgyny, receding religion, which leads to replacement religions or cults or prejudices, in our case, ideologies. We have huge government subsidies, which make people dependent. And you wrote that in a very beautiful way. You made the connection to being entitled is actually a form of victim mentality.
Yes.
Because
being entitled is a form of victim mentality because it shows that I am a victim of the system, which I certainly don't deserve to be from the point of view of the oikophobe. And we see the same thing it's clear we see the same thing today. But if you have this noxious, cruel, and oppressive hierarchical patriarchy that has always controlled everything, then yes, they owe me something. And it's clear that having that kind of attitude, which then, of course, leads to support for socialism, not that they had that word in antiquity, but for similar phenomena, handouts, as you mentioned, that particular connection is made because if I deserve a handout from these evil people because they have been traditionally oppressive and patriarchal and so on, well, then it stands to reason that everything that they represent, their traditions, their culture, their gods, and so on, that is evil. And so this is another reason why the entitlement mentality and oikophobia go hand in hand, yes.
Which also leads to more fragmentation because suddenly you belong to you have your own interest and you probably belong to an interest group, and that leads to more infighting.
Yeah, and this is what I call neo-tribalism in the book, because tribalism in early civilization, of course, is also tribal in the sense that it's very conservative and very sort of set in its ways, and it's usually small also because it hasn't yet been successful and spread itself. So it's tribalism in a holistic way. The civilization constitutes one tribe. Whereas then you have these, later on, as oikophobia has set in, you have tribelets, small tribes within the civilization. And so that's a neo-tribalism where the civilization as a whole, as a tribe, has disappeared. It's too big to be a tribe. And rather you have your own little tribe within the civilization. So that happens in certainly in Rome, to some extent in Greece, but more in Rome. And absolutely in modern civilizations, of course, yeah.
And it also leads to inflation, which devalues the currency.
Yes.
So this is all going on in Rome at the same time as the barbarians are literally at the gates. Turning to France, because, well, we could go through the Middle Ages, at least, but you can explain why oikophobia didn't occur during the Middle Ages, because that's something one can learn from them.
Right, exactly. So what happens in the Middle Ages, and we're talking about Europe, Western Europe here, of course, but basically Southern Europe as well, to some degree. But what happens essentially is that no civilization is able to be successful enough. So as we talked about before, the prerequisites of oikophobia are a certain sense of security and wealth and leisure and so on, at least for a portion of the population. And those circumstances simply do not obtain in the Middle Ages. And you have a very small class of educated people, monks in monasteries, basically, but very often even the king himself doesn't know how to read and write. And so you're not talking there about a broader leisure class that can sort of come together and criticize each other and criticize their own civilization. So none of those prerequisites really hold, which is not to say, of course, that there isn't any scholarly or scientific advancement during the Middle Ages. There certainly is, but it's simply not strong enough, and it's not cohesive enough is another important term, I think. It's not cohesive enough for such a thing to develop. You have little islands of innovation, certainly within the Middle Ages, but it's not connected to a broader successful culture and to a broader successful civilization that is able to insist on itself and that has been sufficiently successful against outside forces to be able to sort of relax, so to speak, and say, well, aren't we great and aren't we successful? And now it's time to start looking at ourselves. That never happens during the Middle Ages. And it's not until modernity that any civilization is able to really do that.
Well, the Middle Ages hits the Renaissance, and then from the Renaissance, it's just a short jump to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. So why does it occur in France?
So the French, of course, always have to be at the forefront of everything, the avant-garde for both good and bad. That's what they do. But it starts in France because France is, in modernity, it starts in France simply because they are the first civilization to be sufficiently successful in this sense. You could say the Spanish Empire to some extent, but in Spain, I don't really talk so much about, I mentioned a little bit in the book, I don't talk so much about Spain because that sense of egalitarianism simply hasn't matured sufficiently in Europe yet at that point as a philosophy. You have a certain, Cervantes obviously is probably the most obvious name, where you can see a certain poking fun at certain of one's own tradition, but he's certainly not an oikophobe. He fights at the Battle of Lepanto. He's certainly, no one can make that accusation against him. It's really in France where we have a sufficiently large leisure class and sufficient security. And now obviously that starts, when it starts, it's basically under Louis XV when it starts. And France, of course, is not a democracy at that time. But the king, and the same had been true under Louis XIV, the king is still tolerant enough for most of these people to be able to do what they do in relative peace. You might have the government censors, striking certain passages in a text or something like that, but it's nothing compared to the dictatorships of the 20th century. So people like Voltaire or Condorcet or d'Alembert, all these people, they're still able to write what they write. Diderot is another important name in this regard.
There's another thing, actually. You said that Voltaire has not been very critical of Islam.
Right.
That's not true. Have you not read Muhammad the Prophet?
No, he does. He certainly criticized Islam as well. I mentioned Hinduism as the religion to which he's the friendliest. And Christianity, the religion, of course, because he's an oikophobe, to which he's the unfriendliest. Islam is mixed. He says he does criticize Islam, you're right. But he also has, as compared to Christianity, there are also passages where he's a little friendlier, whereas off the top of my head, I don't think I can think of any passage where he's outright friendly toward Christianity. He's the idea of God in general. He's not some sort of militant atheist in the sense that he pokes fun of God like the modern atheists today. So he's still a bit more circumspect in that regard. But Christianity as an institution, he's certainly the most critical of that. But Islam is a bit of a gray area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry that I interrupted.
No,
you just
not at
came
all.
to me.
No, but
please
you're right.
go on.
But so the government in those days is still tolerant enough of dissident voices. I mean, there's certain things you can't say, but they're still tolerant enough of dissident voices that they're able to do what they do relatively undisturbed, and that is a prerequisite of oikophobia. I mean, Louis XIV. Now, Louis XIV is still before oikophobia has begun in France, but Louis XIV seems to. I mean, he was brutal in many other ways. He waged brutal wars against the countries around him, but in terms of internal policy, he did. It seems like he had a sense of humor. You know, there are certain plays that were presented that were critical of certain aspects of the government, and there's a record of Louis XIV kind of laughing at it and thinking that it's funny and so on. So he's not some sort of rabid schizophrenic. Well, not schizophrenic, but he's not some rabid paranoiac or something like that. And nor is Louis XV. Louis XV even tries to institute certain reforms, not very competently, but so the French kings, by and large, are tolerant enough that oikophobia can still become possible. And France is at this time the most powerful nation in Europe. I mean, England is giving them a run for their money, but basically, the English at this time, they're a lot more bourgeois, for lack of a better word. They are more focused on commerce and things like that. They have other things to do than to start. Oikophobia comes in Britain later, and when it does come, it comes very intensely. But that's well over 100 years after it starts in France. And the ideas of the Enlightenment, which there is, of course, there are other forms of Enlightenment outside of France that I think are much better. The Scottish Enlightenment, of course, especially, but the German Enlightenment to some extent, but especially the Scottish Enlightenment, I think, is the best Enlightenment. And the French Enlightenment is the worst, because the French Enlightenment is the one where the critique of religion and critique of traditional Catholic and French ways, with which one can sympathize, of course, in specific instances. I mean, as a non-religious person myself, I can certainly sympathize with certain critiques of religion. But the problem is that since religion is the cornerstone of every society, it is the most fundamental thing of every civilization, whether we like it or not. There is no exception to that rule. It's always religion. So if you pull out that foundation, everything else tumbles. And that is what happens in France. And you don't find people criticizing religion in France and leaving everything else alone. Once they start criticizing religion, you know they're going to start criticize other aspects of French culture as well, and that is what happens. And other things start to take over as well, which might seem fairly innocuous to us today, but it's a point of understanding how it works relative to their own tradition. So if they start to talk about the equality of all human beings, regardless of whether you're from Europe or Africa or anywhere else.
Which is a sympathetic thought.
Right, exactly. Which is why to us today, that seems, well, what's wrong with that, we might say. But the point is, from their point of view, from the more traditional point of view, that is a sort of tearing down of French tradition, because that is not the traditional French opinion. For reasons I talk about in the book, every manifestation of oikophobia becomes more severe.
Yes,
with every
there's
iteration.
An upward spiral motion that you identify.
Exactly.
You call it
helical, yeah.
Helical.
Exactly. And so, like a helicopter, it moves in a spiral. And so,
because for every collapsing civilization, the following civilization can start at a higher ground, so to speak.
Exactly so. And so we sort of build on what other civilizations have already accomplished. And it's also because the circumstances that we've talked about, the free intellectual space, egalitarianism, wealth, all of those circumstances, all of those prerequisites for oikophobia, they all apply in greater measure with every civilization. Again, Rome is the exception.
Because first, the civilization doesn't know itself, and it's like super xenophobic, and it goes and conquers someone else, and it's like, we're the greatest.
Yeah.
And then it loses some war, and they're like, maybe we're not the greatest.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe the others had it right, and they start looking for explanations in other cultures, and then they start importing concepts.
Yes.
Which at first might even be good for them, because it might enrich their culture, but eventually it fragments and falls.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And that's important. That's also another reason and I'm glad you raised that point, because we mustn't say that simply because we've imported some other aspect of another culture that's a manifestation of oikophobia. Not at all. Every culture does that, and it can often be a very good thing. It's a necessary thing very often, certainly in the earlier stages of a culture. But it comes a point where those foreign elements just simply start to take over. But because these circumstances, because these prerequisites are present in a much stronger form today, our egalitarianism is more egalitarian than was Greek egalitarianism. Our wealth is greater. Our intellectual space is more open and freer. Now that's maybe starting to change a little bit, unfortunately, but traditionally it has been. And so therefore it makes sense that our oikophobia would also be more intense because the prerequisites of oikophobia are even stronger today than they were in the past. And that's why every manifestation of oikophobia becomes more and more extreme. And so this is why we can look back in history at certain manifestations of oikophobia in the past and say, well, that wasn't so bad, was it? But the point is that when it comes to understanding why we are where we are today, whether we agree with past self-haters or not, the point is to understand, we can understand ourselves by looking at them. And although I would still say that there are many manifestations of oikophobia in the past that are still worthy of blame and critique, even from our point of view today. I mean, Voltaire, since we mentioned him recently, when he defends Hinduism as against Christianity, for example, I think he's completely wrong. And he defends the vegetarianism of certain Indian tribes as compared to meat-eating Frenchmen. Again, I think he's completely wrong.
And here we return vegetarianism as a sort of a symptom of a falling civilization.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, because to people early on in a civilization who did not have all of the luxury of choice that we have. I mean, now you can go to any vegetarian restaurant and get a great meal. And early on in a civilization, of course, you don't have that. Eating animal flesh is
luxury.
Is luxury. It's something you can do. It's a festive thing. It's something you look forward to. The Greeks were mostly vegetarian, but not for moral reasons, simply because that's what they had. When there was a religious festival, they sacrificed an animal to the gods. Then you partook in the sacrificial meat of the animal, and so it was a wonderful thing. And so vegetarianism, again, as you say, it is a sign of a declining civilization.
What else can we recognize from the French Revolution that you have seen in the previous, and what sets the French fall from civilizational height apart from previous?
Yeah, so what happens, what we recognize from previous civilizations in French oikophobia is the vegetarianism, the attack on one's own religion, most certainly. Where it's a bit different is in this universalism. The Greeks did not have a sense of universalism, this sort of... Now, it starts... I shouldn't say that completely. We mentioned Diogenes before and some of those others. They do consider themselves cosmopolitans in the sense that, yes, I'm a citizen of the world. But that's something that's still very abstract to them because they don't really have much of a sense...
Well, not for Diogenes. Right. He was exiled from Sinope.
Yes.
So he didn't have a choice.
Right.
Really.
Right. No, yes. Exactly. No, this is true. After Alexander the Great... that starts to change a little bit. They come more into contact with other civilizations, but by then we're not talking about a cohesive Greek civilization anymore anyway, or about a cohesive Athenian civilization. Whereas to the French, that's a much more concrete thing because by then, of course, they actually have an understanding. Most people have never met an Indian or somebody from the jungle of Africa or what have you, but they're much more aware of these other peoples in a much more real sense. And so I would say that this more concrete universalism is something which sets the French apart. The androgyny, again, French androgyny is well known, but that's the same as in previous civilizations. Again, it doesn't take exactly the same form, but the concept itself does take place, and that's the same in that sense. I would say the universalism is probably what the French sort of contribute, and or that's the most French manifestation of their oikophobia. Yes.
Yeah. And then Britain.
So Britain becomes a little more modern every time we see it, a little more recognizable to us every time we see it. Again, some of these ancillary phenomena are very recognizable to us even now, going all the way back to Greece. What Britain adds to it, what we see in Britain for the first time is oikophobia more in the lower classes as well. So in France, as in Greece and Rome, it's still rather an upper class phenomenon. not necessarily an aristocrat phenomenon, but maybe upper middle class at least. You don't like, not all of the oikophobes in France were aristocrats, but they were educated. They were
the ones with time, money, and
exactly, who could sit around in the cafe by the Seine River and drink 40 cups of coffee a day, as Voltaire supposedly did, if I remember correctly. He had, which maybe explains why he was so hyper all the time. But in Britain, you start to see it seeping into the lower classes as well. Certainly it's still mostly an upper class phenomenon or an intellectual phenomenon, as it is today. But around the time of the Boer War, so 1899 to 1902, and a little bit, it kind of starts 1880s, 1890s around there in Britain, so still well over a century after France, one sees that it comes, and here we see it go very hand in hand with the socialist mentality. You have left-wing members of parliament who represent and themselves come from lower class groups, or at least lower middle class, certainly not from aristocratic groups, who attack British norms, British customs, and so on. And who consider the Boers to be in the right, for example, in the Boer War. And again, it's not a question
of... And the Boer War, that was after they lost the colonies. Or the United States, as they're called nowadays.
Yes, right, exactly.
Although I don't recognize them.
Right, yes, exactly. That was well over a century after. And so France is oikophobic at the time of the American Revolution. The British are not. And so it's interesting, I think, also to see why it happens at different times in different nations. But so that's around when it starts, and that is really also it starts a little bit after the civilizational peak, if you will. When you think of when is a civilization the most powerful vis-a-vis its neighbors, in Athens it's the mid 5th century BC, and oikophobia starts in the late 5th century BC. In Rome, it's a little harder to say because they just have such a long history, but it certainly starts still after they have reached their peak. It depends what you consider their peak. It's a little hard to say exactly in the case of Rome, but maybe something like late Republic, early Empire. Whereas in France...
Augustus.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah, you'd probably say, you're probably right. It would depend.
What?
What is there to argue about? Yeah. Well, I guess it depends a little bit because I'm thinking in terms of territorial expansion, right? So they have a little more territory later on.
Okay, yeah, sure.
But yeah.
It was good days.
It was good days. Yeah, and in many ways, I mean, the Augustan peace. I mean, they didn't have a war. They had little skirmishes here and there, but they basically had a century of peace, which in the Roman case, of course, is very unusual. In France, their peak, I mean, you have Napoleon, of course, later on, but that's a very brief sort of end flourish, if you will. Overall, the peak is really under Louis XIV, and oikophobia kind of starts under Louis XV. And in Britain, you would say their peak is about sort of the mid-Victorian era, 1860s, 1870s. That's about their geopolitical peak, if you will. Yeah. And oikophobia starts to set in a couple of decades after that. And for us in the United States, our peak was arguably in the 1950s or so after World War II. Well, it depends how you count it.
I think Top Gun, when the first Top Gun movie came out.
So you're right in a sense that late 20th century is our peak insofar as once you no longer have the Soviet Union, we're the only superpower left on the planet.
Yeah.
In that sense, it is our peak, yes. But it's still other civilizations. The move toward a multipolar world, which of course we're seeing very much now, has already kind of begun there. If you think about the 1950s, in the 1950s, the American government could change the government of Iran with a few CIA operatives, basically, because everybody else was ignorant and illiterate over there. Nowadays, even in the 1990s, they couldn't do such a thing because other countries were relatively stronger. And so, again, it depends a little bit on how you measure it. But if you take at least the exception of the Soviet Union still existing, I would say about the 1950s, and then oikophobia starts.
I buy the 1950s, man. Yeah. And I think the 1980s was one of those flourishes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean Reagan. Yeah,
that's towards the end of the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
and then you have the listless 90s.
Yeah, right.
And then
when I was intelligent enough to move to the United States, exactly. And Reagan, I think, helped a lot in that regard in bringing about that little flourish, if you will. But overall, again, in the United States, oikophobia starts about 15, 20 years later, late 60s, 70s. Everybody knows what happened then. But that's really when oikophobia starts. You see certain signs of it in the 50s, even earlier in the 20s in the United States, but that's really when it starts as a mass phenomenon. And so, I'm not actually sure now how I got into the timing here, but of the when it starts.
We jumped from Britain to the United States.
Right. Yes.
Which is your second last chapter, actually.
Yes, right. I spent
in the book.
Yeah.
And also, I think the chapter with the least examples of oikophobia. It's mostly a method discussion.
I think, because I have kind of two chapters on the United States, but they're different. I have one, the past, the United States, the past, where I kind of just talk about the historical development. So just at the very end of that chapter, we see the first sort of examples of oikophobia, whereas I then have, because I think the United States is the most relevant. I mean, partly it's my own country, but also because the United States is still the one superpower in the world. I mean, that's changing now slowly, but and so I think it's very relevant to see exactly how it plays itself out there. So that's when, in that chapter, the United States, the present, that's when I sort of talk about the cultural expression of oikophobia in the United States today, so I think that kind of deserves a chapter of its own. But yeah, in terms of Britain, I think it's the fact that the lower classes kind of join the mix to some extent that we see in Britain for the first time, and which also makes sense because the lower classes are, relatively speaking, more powerful vis-a-vis the rest of their civilization than is the case in earlier civilizations. And that is, of course, the ironic thing, and that's the internal contradiction of oikophobia, because you can only become oikophobic if you're relatively successful, because that sort of gives you a sense of your own self-worth, and that feeds that vanity. And so it makes sense in France, the lower classes weren't in the same position as they were in England, because England, again, ironically, right, it's a bit paradoxical, but because the British had been, relatively speaking, successful in elevating also their lower classes economically and so on, and in terms of political participation, that it would make sense that that's when we also, even though it's still a kind of an elitist phenomenon, that's where we sort of start to see it also elsewhere. And
the Church of England increased literacy because they started preaching in English.
Right. Yes. Yeah, exactly. No, good point. And yeah, the English have always, and traditionally, and with good reason, considered themselves, even before the United States came into existence, the English traditionally considered themselves the free people. As you know, they compared themselves to the French, to the German states, and so on. They always considered, I'm English, I'm free.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that stands to reason.
Freedom and liberty. We will get to that. But first, the United States.
Yes.
Because the United States, I think, is the Rome of our day. I don't mean to label you as such, but you have built the capital pretty much modeled on ancient Rome. Yeah. So, I mean, it looks like Rome, and they have divided the world up into effectively military governance. Or
to some extent,
CENTCOMs.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And now you can be a woman can be a man.
Yep. We're very proud of that, of course. Yeah.
Democratic Socialists of America are the fastest growing political movement in your country.
Don't remind me.
They are egalitarian.
I await November with dread. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. They just want an all-powerful dictator, and then everyone else should be the same.
Yes, exactly. Primus inter pares, as the Romans said, the first among equals.
Yes, precisely. Mm-hmm. And the barbarians are, well, not exactly at your gates, but they're definitely inside your empire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, those parallels will make sense, unfortunately.
And religion is receding.
Yes.
Faith in institutions is eroding. Mm. So, if I ask most people around the world, they will say, well, all civilizations have ups and downs. This is not the end. What do you say to them?
I think that they're right that it's not literally the end. I do think American civilization will continue for a long time, but that doesn't mean that it's not sharply declining. We certainly are. Now, and this is one other difference between civilizational decline in modernity and civilizational decline in antiquity. If you're declining civilization in antiquity, you will almost definitely be overrun by the barbarians, and everything will be destroyed, and the women will be raped, and so on.
And you will disappear.
And you will disappear, precisely. Now, that doesn't happen in modern times as dramatically. Now, the fact that
the Germans are still around.
The Germans are still around, yes, exactly, although they're certainly becoming less German, but yes, they are still around. And the fact that we're declining obviously doesn't mean that we're about to be invaded by the armies of Mexico or Canada. And so the United States just like Britain, after their civilizational or after their imperial collapse, were certainly able to continue to exist. But there will be, and so in that sense, we're lucky to be alive in modern times. But there is still that slow erosion. Again, we don't have this sort of dramatic collapse. I mean, never say never, but probably not. We don't have this sort of very sudden dramatic collapse. It wasn't sudden in Rome either. It took place over centuries, but when it came, it was very brutal and very dramatic. So we don't have that, but we do have this sort of slow withering away. And so when people say that we have our ups and downs in the United States, we're not going to be invaded by Canada or anything like that, and they say that we're being alarmist, that somebody like me is being alarmist, I say, well, it's not that we're being alarmist. We're not saying that, everything is going to come tumbling down tomorrow, but it's still we still have reason to be very careful and cautious about the future, because we are certainly in sharp decline. And sharp American decline in our particular case is going to lead to more war in the world, because the world order has, since World War II, required a strong United States. And I mean, I was warning people about this already 20 years ago. And of course, as you can imagine, the French and the Germans laughed at me when I said that, when I was living in those countries.
Well, you were also very young.
I was very young, but I think some of them now are starting to, of course, they would never apologize to me, but I still think that sort of sotto voce, privately, they might admit that people, not only me, of course, others as well. I'm sure you've talked about it as well, but it's kind of.
I was at my in-laws a few weeks ago, and they reminded me of the first time they met me, and they said, "What do you think about the future since you do what you do?" And I said, "Well, race war, obviously, is what I think." Yeah, and they thought, "What a crazy little man." Yeah, yes. And then they told me now, just the other week, they said. And now all we want to do is rub you to see what else type of prophecy you can spit out.
No, excellent. And that was just a couple of weeks ago?
Yes.
So they changed their minds quickly.
Well, yeah.
So credit to your in-laws for being open-minded and
very open-minded people.
Excellent, good. Yes. And so
also the facts by now in Sweden are irrefutable.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Actually, I probably I should ask you some questions about that.
We'll do that at dinner.
At dinner, excellent. I look forward to it. But yeah, and so exactly, and so this warning that you and I and certain other people have come with now for many years weren't taken seriously until now. I mean, not by everyone, but there are certain people who at least have started to understand that yes, actually, maybe we were onto something. Partly by what's happening in England, of course, right now, but also in the United States. Every country has its own particular set of problems. They're not exactly the same from country to country. But
I live in a country that has enjoyed 250 years of relative peace.
Exactly.
And has created through the welfare state, which could start and continue uninterrupted through 2 world wars, an enormous leisure class.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes. That was interesting, actually, in your book.
And social democracy. I recognized... some of the ideas went through, even though we're epistemologically different. Some of the ideas are recurring in both our works. And they also, mine is not an academic work, obviously. I do whatever I want, and you have to defend your method.
Right.
But they are quite similar.
Yeah.
And you discover these tendencies, and you describe it as a sort of cyclical thing, which I attribute less to determinism and more to human nature, if I understand you correctly.
Yes, although I wouldn't really distinguish between those. I mean, you're right. It's determinism is a dangerous word to use and one that I avoid, not because I'm anti-deterministic, but simply because I think people will misunderstand me. But
you seem to be against free will, because that's the epilogue.
Right, yeah, that's the epilogue. But the point of the epilogue, or should we get into...
Yeah,
should we
sure.
Get into the
it's
epilogue
one of the few critiques I have. So,
okay, excellent. So
let's delve into it.
Excellent, okay.
Yes, so I'm a believer in free will.
Yes.
And I am that because I have a common sense defense of free will. And I also have a common sense definition of free will.
Okay.
And whenever I read philosophers talking about free will, I always think proponents and opponents alike have a very strange definition of free will.
So it could be that maybe I agree with your definition of free will.
Well, so my definition of free will is simply this. It's very common sense. Free will is the choice you make between the possibilities that are presented to you. in reality.
Right.
In each situation, you're presented with a series of possibilities, and sure, you're affected by your upbringing and your religion or ideology or experience, all of that. But you still have, as far as I'm concerned, those choices. So that is how I view free will. And whenever I read someone who opposes it, I always think, but you're not talking about free will. You're talking about omnipotence, an idea that you can do whatever you want in the universe, regardless of limits or limitations.
Yeah. I think most defenders of free will do recognize the limitations, as you mentioned. But by that definition of free will, the way you just said it, I don't have a problem with that.
Right.
Because you said you have these choices.
Yes.
And I agree with that. The question
but you
is,
also
to what extent are the choices
moral
free?
Responsibility and free will.
Yes, exactly.
And I connected to.
Right.
Yes.
But so that's something where I'm a Humean. Hume, and this is part of what Kant didn't like about Hume. Hume is somebody who says that choice is not necessary for a free choice, I should say, is not necessary for responsibility. And if you think about it, that does make some sense, at least historically, in the sense that the idea of moral responsibility for what you do has been around since the beginning of civilization. It has to exist. Nothing can work if you don't have that. But the idea of free will has been around for less than 2,000 years. It's kind of started. I mean, the first seeds of free will has been around for longer, but the full-fledged idea of free will has been around for less than 2,000 years. So what did people do before then? That shows, at least historically, even if you do connect them, it shows that historically you don't have to make that connection. But with what you said,
most people before then, I think, believed in fate and had a cyclical conception of time.
So it depends. Yes, the Greeks especially, more so. The Romans a little less in the sense that they had a much longer history to look back to. So it was easier for the Romans not to consider history cyclical, because they could look back. I mean, it depends on what Romans we're talking about, but they could look back at an empire that had lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. So they had every reason to believe that it's going to continue for however long, which the Greeks didn't have. So the Romans actually have a somewhat more developed, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were right in every respect. Obviously, they had different opinions among themselves, but they had a more developed sense of history in that sense than the Greeks did. And so to the Greeks had a more confined sense of history. So in that sense, it's easier for them to have a more cyclical view. But when it comes to choice, you can have a choice. I can choose between two things. That doesn't mean that it's a free choice. And again, of course, that depends on what do you mean by a free choice. Well, it depends, and I do define I do give the definition in the book, which is that you could have chosen differently under identical circumstances. And the answer to that is no, you couldn't, because there's no additional part of you that can go beyond the things that make that choice in that moment.
And I think that my definition of free will would be that you could make a different choice under the exactly same circumstances.
Okay, so then we do disagree. Yeah.
In the exact same circumstance, between stealing the candy in the store that you really want, you're a small child and no one's watching, and not stealing the candy, right, you could still resist the urge to take the candy without paying for it.
You can resist the urge, but that if you do resist the urge, that means in every iteration of those ideal circumstances, you will resist it. Yeah.
Yes, but that would be the defense. But the counter argument to that defense, that it's all predetermined. There's no goal, end goal to your actions. They're all predetermined. Every situation in every given moment is predetermined. But the counter argument to that would be, well, it seems to me that people who believe in free will act out free will, thus manifesting free will, which makes it become real.
But that's the argument. So that argument was answered by Chrysippus in the 3rd century BC. Now, he doesn't use the terminology free will because that terminology doesn't exist yet. But he talks about it from the point of view of fatalism. Is something fated to happen or not? Mm-hmm. And his answer is to this point is that when you're living it out in the way that you just described it, everything that you live out is itself concomitantly fated. Right?
Yes, I understand the argument. Right. I just don't agree with it.
Okay, no, that's perfectly fine. But you can't.
And also the counter argument. I mean, obviously, is not my strongest argument for free will. It's a common sense argument, not a pragmatic argument, which is what belief in free will, manifesting free will, becoming a reality is. It's pragmatic.
Yeah. But the point that he makes, and which I sort of, I mean, I don't just regurgitate it, I adapt it to obviously the topic in the book. But the point is that this particular argument, and I mean, a version of that argument has also been made for almost 2,000 years, the common sense argument, which is that, well, then why do you bother to do anything? And the idea is that...
Here's one hand, here's another hand.
Right, exactly. The point is that those two hands and the fact that you bother, that in itself is part of the nexus. Because the mistake that this common sense argument makes is that it assumes that the thing that you're talking about is accepted from the discussion at hand. If you say that, okay, why do I bother to do anything? You're taking that action and you're pulling it outside of the nexus of determinism, which is to say that you're already assuming from the beginning of the argument that it's true, which is to say that you're begging the question. Yeah. Yeah, because you're saying, okay, so why do I bother to do anything? The fact that you're even reasoning in that way is not an exception to the nexus of determinism. It's a part of it. And so by saying that, well, then why do I reason that way? I think the point is that is not outside of the nexus of determinism, even though the people who make this argument assume that it is. And so they are beginning, it's a circular argument because they're beginning with a point that they want to establish. But I think what's important to emphasize, and this is really why I wrote the epilogue, is not simply to reject free will, because otherwise one can fairly ask, what does that have to do with oikophobia?
Yes.
What does that have to do with the rise and fall of civilizations? The reason I wrote that is because when you talk about the rise and fall of civilizations, people will accuse you of being a determinist, and they will say, well, then why, as you say, why do I bother to do anything? And the point that I'm trying to establish in the epilogue, which again, it's that point, the epilogue is maybe the more technical part of the book, the more philosophically technical part of the book, which is why it's an epilogue. But it's because I want to make the very much not left-wing point that even if we don't have free will, and I don't insist, the point isn't to convince people that we don't have free will. I think it's better actually for society if people believe that we do have free will. The point that I'm making is that even if we were to say that we do not have free will, and even if we were to say that civilizations do fall and rise in this cyclical and helical pattern that I describe in the book, nonetheless, our actions are very important, because I don't want to be told, oh, well, then why should we bother not to do anything? It is very important what we do. The point is simply, and this goes back to the early Stoic argument by Chrysippus, that even the things that we do to improve our civilization, those things themselves are also concomitantly fated. They're concomitantly determined. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do them, obviously. If we decide not to do them for that reason, then that decision in itself is concomitantly fated. But the idea is simply that regardless of what happens, regardless of civilizational cycles, we all have to work hard to improve things,
yes,
and to try to help our civilization. So in that sense, I'm completely on
that would be my definition of free will,
right?
Not just laying down to die,
right? Exactly,
and
but that
actually
is
working hard.
Absolutely, but so
is a choice, right? You choose between death and life.
No, I 100% agreed, and this is why the epilogue is important, because I want to make this point. In spite of the lack of free will, as I believe. And in spite of the rise and fall of civilizations, which may make us feel that things are very deterministic, well, our civilization is going to decline anyway, because we can see that this always happens. So why even bother trying to save it? The point is, we still have to bother to try to save it. And that's really what the epilogue is about.
Well, it was a wonderfully entertaining read.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Thank you.
Very stimulating.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for coming to Deconstructive Criticism.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Deconstructive Criticism with this episode's guest, Benedict Beckeld. As soon as we had finished talking, I thought of at least 2 more subjects within the scope of this conversation that I regret not bringing up when I had a chance. So you will hear from Benedict again very soon. Meanwhile, you can find his book, Western Self-Contempt, where you buy books. I suggest you give it a read. A huge thanks for supporting deconstructive criticism on patreon.com/AaronFlam or Swish 0768943737, 0768943737. You can also buy my own book, This is a Swedish Tiger, in English at my website, although it might be more practical, since the shipping costs are huge, to buy it as an ebook on Amazon Kindle. This is a Swedish Tiger can be found on Amazon, and it's a book about Sweden and why it has committed its own civilizational suicide. Please purchase your copy today. I'm Aaron Flam.